LTT that drove the Sinhalese and Muslim out of the north and east virtually overnight. And it was the LTT that held Tamils captive and made them suffer for many years. If any Tamil children did not have the opportunity to study and forge better lives for themselves, it was because they lived in LTT-controlled territory and were conscripted as frontline soldiers or suicide bombers at the tender age of 12, 13 or 14. If any Tamil families spent many sleepless nights fearing for their future, it was because they lived under the LTT and had no prospects at all for a better life. If successful Tamil businessmen and professionals were forced to maintain a low profile in the rest of the country, it was because they feared being kidnapped and held for ransom by LTT operatives. The bane of the Tamil community in Sri Lanka was not the Sinhalese, nor the armed forces, nor the government. It was in fact the LTTE. That is ultimately why we called our efforts to liberate the north and east a humanitarian operation. We were not just liberating territory from the LTTE's control. We were rescuing hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians from its cruel grip. By combating the LTTE, conclusively defeating it, we were not just winning a long drawn-out war against an old enemy. We were rescuing an entire nation from the constant threat and hellish horrors of terrorism. A second problem that some observers in the international community had with the resumption of a military campaign in Sri Lanka was the issue of proportionality. These observers, unfortunately, lacked the perspective necessary to understand the true nature of the LTT. They thought of the LTT as a small organization, essentially no more than an underdog standing up to a full might of a national military. Again, the LTT's propaganda machine played an important role in fueling this misconception. The truth of the matter is that despite its modus operandi of terrorism and its origins as a small band of militants, the LTT had grown into a massive terrorist organization that had the ability to stand up to the Sri Lankan armed forces over the years. On previous occasions, the LTT had enjoyed several victories over our military. They had overrun the Poonareen military camp in 1993 and the Mullatiu military camp in 1996, killing several thousand troops. From 1998 to 1999, the LTT scored several key victories against the armed forces, killing thousands of troops and recapturing a great deal of territory. In the year 2000, the LTT captured Elephant Pass, which was held by nearly 12,000 soldiers in a major operation. All in all, by the time our military campaign resumed in 2005, the LTT had killed more than 26,000 armed service personnel. This was no small band of militants, but a large, sophisticated military force comprising approximately 30,000 cadres, a very large arsenal of weapons and equipment, and thousands of civilians organized as auxiliary forces. The LTT is the only terrorist organization in the world to have had a sophisticated naval wing, as well as a fledgling air force with aircraft capable of dropping bombs in Colombo. Those who thought that the Sri Lankan response was disproportionate had absolutely no perspective on the issue. Unfortunately, because Sri Lanka is a small country with limited resources, it was not possible for us to give the management of non-critical foreign opinion the same level of attention we gave to India and other key nations. As such, these misconceptions remained largely intact. Even more sadly, a number of influential figures in the international community formed very strong opinions, or should I say, jumped to very hastily conclusions about our conduct of the war. Some of these assumptions and misunderstandings have proven hard to shake even to this day. This is deeply disappointing to the government because one of the most important facets of the Sri Lankan war against terrorism was the immense care which it was conducted. Ensuring zero civilian casualties was an overriding priority for everyone involved in the humanitarian operations, from the political leadership to the military personnel on the field of battle. Training on human rights, international humanitarian law, and the law of armed conflicts, as well as highlighting the necessity to protect civilians, has been integral to the training syllabi of the Sri Lankan armed forces for many years. Moreover, when the operations commenced, strict orders were given to the military at Security Council meetings to avoid civilian losses and minimize destruction of civilian property. These orders were included in the operational orders, handed down through the chain of command, and all our military personnel on the ground were very conscious of the fact that the civilian casualties would not be acceptable. Of course, in keeping with its brutal nature, the LTT did its best to make these orders hard to follow. Historically, the LTT has made sure that its leaders, operational centers, and gun positions are well located within areas populated by civilians. As our operations progressed and the LTT lost battle after battle, they started to withdraw from these entrenched positions in the towns and villages. Instead of withdrawing their cadres alone, however, they herded the civilians who lived in these areas alongside them as they retreated. They also mined the villages and towns they left behind, making sure no one could safely go back. A couple of 100,000 civilians were taken out of their homes and driven from their villages as the military campaign progressed. These civilians were to serve as a human shield for the LTT, which was beginning to realize it was outmatched in the field of battle. Humanitarian assistance that was being organized for these civilians through the government with assistance from various organizations, including the World Food Programme, the ICRC, and other international agencies, was also blatantly appropriated by the LTT. This forced migration of civilians posed a significant obstacle to our humanitarian operations. The Sri Lankan military responded by taking the uttermost care in all its offensive. Small group warfare was extensively employed, even though it meant placing our troops at a greater risk of harm by the enemy. A great deal of effort was put into intelligence gathering through the penetration of special forces into enemy territory and the comprehensive use of technology. The establishment of no-fire zones and safe corridors gave civilians an opportunity to escape into areas that had already been cleared. Of course, the LTT did its best to prevent their escape by shooting at them whenever they attempted to flee. This is a live video taken by the Air Force using the UAV. and it was shown to the diplomatic community at that time at the Air Force headquarters. It was very clearly shows how the LTT cadres are keeping the civilians under the gunpoint. The LTT also established their artillery positions at places such as hospitals and within civilian encampments in order to limit the army's ability to retaliate. As a result, especially towards the end of the campaign, the use of heavy weaponry was significantly curtailed and then stopped outright. The extensive use of technology by all of the Sri Lankan armed forces during their operations did a great deal of minimizing civilian losses. Footage from unmanned aerial vehicle was studied to enable the acquisition of the legitimate enemy targets, which were destroyed using precision-guided munitions. Air Force pilots were specially trained to identify and target enemy positions with great accuracy. The minimum amount of necessary force was always used in munitions to ensure that the damage dealt was localized so that the minimal harm would come to civilians and civilian property in the vicinity. Through these measures, the Sri Lankan armed services ensured that collateral damage was kept to an absolute minimum during the course of the entire campaign. Above and beyond containing incidental harm to civilians, the military also did a lot to try and ensure that humanitarian aid was reaching the civilians trapped in the LTT's clutch. The Navy protected sea lines of communication to facilitate